Good afternoon, and welcome to the third annual Gates Forum Keynote Conversation. I'm Mike Tierney. I'm the director of the Global Research Institute here at William & Mary. GRI is a multidisciplinary hub that convenes scholars, practitioners, and students to address pressing global problems. We're home to 9 different research labs and a network of affiliated scholars and partner organizations. At GRI, we are committed to using the best evidence and research methods to address important policy problems. Nowhere is this commitment better realized than our work on the Gates Forum. The idea behind the Gates Forums is clear: to produce original research that practitioners can use to inform bipartisan solutions to national security problems. Over the past 3 years, we've partnered with Chancellor Robert M. Gates to tackle the issues of strategic communication in U.S. foreign policy and foreign assistance in U.S. foreign policy. Today marks the start of Gates Forum 3, which will explore U.S. sanctions policies and economic statecraft more generally. Note that the first 3 forums focus on non-military tools of national power. This focus is consistent with Chancellor Gates' latest book, where he argues that the United States has underinvested in non-military solutions to international security challenges. So over the next few days, we'll host high-level government officials, scholars, and industry leaders to answer 2 overarching questions. First, how can the United States reimagine its economic statecraft to advance its national interests, deliver effective results, and respond to changing international circumstances? Second, how can the United States bolster and enlarge an open economic order? To guide the discussions at this forum and help inform the policy options that emerge from it, my colleagues at GRI, Eric Brown and Dr. Ryan Musto, have produced an original research volume that draws upon the expertise of leading scholars, some of whom are in this room with us this evening. This afternoon, you'll get a preview of some of the issues that will be discussed at the Gates Forums. Now, on the logistics, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand during the Q&A, and we'll have mic runners who will be looking for you. Given the size of the crowd, all guests that need to leave from the tiered seating in the back should leave from the 2 back doors, and if you're sitting down here in the front, you should leave from that door right there if you need to leave the room. I'm now pleased to introduce William & Mary's president, Catherine Rowe, who will introduce our guests. Without President Rowe's support, we would not have the Gates Forums. The ideas for this started with President Reevely, and President Rowe has landed the plane. So, Catherine, take it away.
Thank you, Director Tierney. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. We're so glad to see you here. It's a special pleasure to welcome our neighbors, alumni, and students, members of the Board of Visitors, President Emeritus Taylor Reevely and Helen Reevely, faculty and staff. Thanks for being here. I want to begin today's conversation with a big picture, talk a little bit about our mission at William & Mary. It's simple, it's high impact, it's got extraordinary efficacy. We teach the skills of freedom, to use the words of the poet and Judge John Charles Thomas. He says that that is what it means to be dedicated to the liberal arts and sciences, artes liberalis, in that ancient, wonderful word for liberty. At William & Mary, we do that by dedicating ourselves to teaching and learning and research. Love those words, love those verbs. Those are the tools we commit to in higher ed because we believe in the positive changes over time that can be cultivated when we make new knowledge together. And we believe that new knowledge is durable, and it will last, and it will improve our world. That's why our nation's leaders look to William & Mary for research that will advance peace worldwide. As Professor Tierney just said, our Global Research Institute brings together cross-disciplinary research teams to build a pipeline for innovative research. Very importantly, undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and staff work together in those teams. As he said, there are 9 powerhouse labs, more than 250 students. I love that number. I'm going to say it over and over again, completing unique internships taking research experiences, mentored by faculty and staff in any given year. Are there students here who are pursuing research? Are there faculty and staff here pursuing research at GRI? We're incredibly proud of that. Keep it up. Nearly $16.5 million in active grants and contracts since 2023. GRI research is published, as we've just heard, in leading scholarly journals, in public-facing outlets. And to quote my favorite quote from GRI, from Aid Data Policy Analysis Director Samantha Custer, when you have an unsolvable problem, when you require data that's not yet been collected, and that data requires methods that have not yet been invented, William & Mary is the place to go. This is the place to investigate questions of global policy in a data-informed way. We are so proud to put our prowess of teaching, learning, and research in the service of our nation's public servants, and to convene the honest, direct, substantive conversations that are needed about how we can change our world for the better. So in this spirit, I am incredibly pleased to welcome our panelists today. Moderator Stephanie Baker, U.S. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, and William & Mary's 24th Chancellor, the Honorable Robert M. Gates. Thank you for being here. Just a few quick words about the three of them. Stephanie Baker writes about business, politics, and science at Bloomberg News. She's a sought-after commentator. Her expertise has been widely featured on Bloomberg Television, BBC, ITV, PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and Times Radio. She just published in September an important book that you all need to go out and buy and read, Punishing Putin: Inside the Economic War Against Russia. So I'm so glad to have you here to tell us more about that. Senator John Cornyn is currently in his 4th term representing Texas. He sits on the Senate Finance, Intelligence, and Judiciary Committees. From 2013 to 2019, he served as the Republican whip. Prior to joining Congress, Senator Cornyn served as a district judge, a member of the Texas Supreme Court, and Texas Attorney General. Thank you so much for being here, sir. And finally, it's my enormous privilege to welcome back to William & Mary our Chancellor, Robert M. Gates. As all of you know, Chancellor Gates is the former head of the CIA and Secretary of Defense and former president of Texas A&M University. No slouch. He knows it. He's served under 8 U.S. presidents. He's the only Secretary of Defense to have served under presidents from different political parties, something that captures what we're committed to at William & Mary, learning through disagreement, growing in knowledge. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama in recognition of his devotion to U.S. service members and his commitment to the American people. In 2012, the Board of Visitors of William & Mary elected him Chancellor and reinvested him in 2019 for a 2nd term. I'll just let you know that he is now, as of this year, surpassed George Washington, our first American chancellor in his tenure. He's a little competitive. Earlier this fall, William & Mary broke ground on the new home for the Global Research Institute, as well as 2 other impactful labs, the Institute for Integrative Conservation and the Whole of Government Center for Excellence, and that building will be named in honor of Chancellor Gates. Chancellor Gates, Senator Cornyn, Mrs. Baker, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for that great introduction, and thanks to William & Mary for hosting us. Thanks to Senator Cornyn and Chancellor Gates for participating. It's great to be here. I just wanted to set the stage for this discussion. I think we're in probably one of the most internationally fraught periods in decades, with Putin threatening his neighbors, tensions between Israel and Iran at their highest in decades, China supporting Russia and Iran to evade sanctions as it threatens to invade Taiwan. And meanwhile, in the US, I think there's an isolationist mood with the re-election of Donald Trump. I think, first off, let's look at how the US should be responding to China. Beijing has been using massive state subsidies to advance its position as a global manufacturing giant and assert its economic and political dominance around the world. It's been funding Putin's war machine through purchasing Russian oil and selling it microelectronics while propping up North Korea's military. President-elect Trump recently announced plans to impose 10% tariffs on all Chinese exports to the U.S. Now, that's lower than what he had talked about on the campaign, the 60% he had mentioned on the campaign, but it's going to, obviously, if he goes ahead, it will have a huge impact. How do you think, Chancellor Gates, I'll start with you, how do you think the U.S. can use tariffs to level the playing field without blowback on U.S. consumers and without alienating allies in Europe?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and especially be with my longtime friend, Senator Cornyn. I think the first, let's go back to the beginning. I think in terms of what we do, the first rule should be, first, do no harm. The last thing we want to do is ignite a global trade war. The name Smoot-Hawley should be in the back of everyone's minds, because that tariff passed in the early 1930s helped contribute to the global depression as worldwide trade began to collapse. So I think tariffs have a place, and I think what Xi is trying to do is avoid making serious economic reforms in China. And in order to prop up the economy, he has greatly expanded their manufacturing capability so that they are sending electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, a variety of things all over the world at prices no one can compete with. So you not only have the US thinking about tariffs on China on these kinds of things, but also the Europeans, because the Europeans are being undercut in these same industries. So my first point would be, I think the tariffs need to be targeted, not across the board. There's no reason to put a tariff on steam irons that are made in China that allow an American consumer to buy a steam iron for $6. But there are a lot of other things that I've just mentioned that could be targeted and should be targeted because the Chinese are essentially dumping. The second point is we ought to impose tariffs on China in cooperation with the Europeans, because they will have much more impact if there isn't an escape clause, if you will, for the Chinese to just send more to Europe. And we know the Europeans are, and we have the same problem with China on this issue. And then the third and final thing I would say is, and something I think we have not done as a government and as a country, we need a serious effort and kind of a crash effort to determine what our vulnerabilities are to retaliatory sanctions from China, and retaliatory not only restrictions but tariffs. So, for example, in response to the recent announcement of more restrictions on selling chips to China, the Chinese have essentially banned the export of germanium, gallium, and antimony to the United States. All three, and they're also buying up in Africa and elsewhere production capabilities for cobalt, nickel, and other rare items. So we need to identify, and those things are all critically important for not only our high-tech industry, but also for our military. So we need to determine where our vulnerabilities are before we impose those tariffs and take dramatic action, and then see what we can do to protect ourselves against retaliatory actions by the Chinese.
Senator Cornyn, do you want to maybe talk about whether or not at least the threat of across-the-board tariffs on China is a useful negotiating tactic?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come here. When Bob Gates asked me to do something, there's only one answer. There's not many people I admire more for his service to our country. So a friend of mine once said that when President Trump says something, he said, I always take what he says seriously, but I never take it literally. And I think in many ways this is something President Trump does to start a negotiation. So I think there's some gap between the rhetoric and the reality. But I also remember someone said that if your only tool is a hammer, you regard every problem as a nail. And so I think we would all agree that this is a much more complex situation than it is, and Secretary Gates mentioned a number of aspects of it that caused me great concern that I don't think tariffs alone are going to be able to solve. I'd love to get at some point Secretary Gates, given his knowledge of Russia and the way we dealt with Russia during the Cold War, it's always struck me as an oddity that the idea was we would contain the Soviet Union because we couldn't change them because of their ideological orientation. Yet our approach to China was just the opposite. We thought by allowing them in the World Trade Organization, by seeing massive foreign investment from the United States into China, that they would somehow change. Well, they didn't. And they basically, Deng Xiaoping said, hide your motives and bide your time. So here we have a major world power and competitor with the United States that's threatening violence against Taiwan and create if not a regional, perhaps even a broader conflict. And now because of the linking of arms between Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, it looks pretty ominous for anybody who's studied history in the run-up to World War II. So this is pretty serious stuff, and I don't think tariffs alone are going to solve the problem.
So President Xi has overseen a huge expansion of Chinese military capabilities while ramping up threats on Taiwan, as you said, saying reunification is inevitable. How do you think the U.S. should be responding to Beijing's ambitions to control Taiwan? And do you think the threat of tariffs or the possibility of tariffs or a possible trade war will affect President Xi's appetite to embark on either a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan? Why don't we start with you, Chancellor Gates?
Well, in all honesty, I think what happens in Ukraine is going to have more of an impact on Xi's decisions with respect to Taiwan than tariffs or trade issues between the United States and China. I mean, I think we need to respond to what China is doing. We clearly need much greater military strength out there. I think that the strengthening of our relationships with Asian countries has been critically important. And frankly, this is something that has happened under both President Trump and President Biden. So President Trump really energized the Quad, which is the association of India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. And President Biden has continued to strengthen that and strengthen the relationship between Japan and South Korea and Australia. Those are all really important. And with the Philippines as well. The Philippines are as much on the front line right now as Taiwan when it comes to the South China Sea. My own view is that the likelihood of Xi invading Taiwan, a massive invasion, is actually pretty small, at least for a number of years. And partly because he has so many other options. And one of them we're watching right now. After Speaker Pelosi's visit, the Chinese imposed a variety of maritime and air exercise areas around Taiwan, which effectively closed off access to Taiwan for commerce for a period of about a week or 10 days. Since then, he has significantly increased the number of ships and airplanes around Taiwan, and he can declare those exercises anytime he wants, creating enormous economic uncertainty and trouble for Taiwan, and that could easily morph into a blockade, and what the Taiwanese call an anaconda strategy. And that would require the United States to fire the first shot, or Taiwan to fire the first shot, in effect starting a war with China. Are either of those countries prepared to do that? So I think it is a perilous time. Xi has made it clear that he considers it, just as Putin thinks it's his destiny to restore the Russian Empire, including Ukraine, Xi considers it's his personal destiny to restore all these lands that belong to China, above all Hong Kong and Taiwan. So his intent is clear. How he gets there is another matter, which puts all the more premium, frankly, on strengthening our military capabilities in that area, because the best way to prevent a war, to deter a war, is through strength, as frankly everybody knows, and as George Washington first said. So the key thing is, how do we unclog our military supply line and our production? How do we build our defense industries so that we can begin to crank there? We're decommissioning ships faster than we're commissioning them. So we have to rebuild our military strength. I think the dispersal of our forces in Asia that's been going on in recent years is a very important thing. But at the end of the day, the one thing that will prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is the knowledge on the part of Xi that he could well lose. And he knows if he loses, the Chinese regime probably will be overthrown. So deterrence is the real solution to this problem of Taiwan. And, frankly, the one path, peaceful path out, which was one country, two systems, was a way that this could have worked out diplomatically and politically. But once Xi took over Hong Kong, he knocked that into a cocked hat. And so that's not going to work.
Senator Cornyn, what's your view? What's the best way to deter China from invading or blockading Taiwan?
A while back, I read one of our military leaders said our goal should be for President Xi to wake up in the morning and say, "Not today." And then tomorrow, when he wakes up, to say, "Not today." So I couldn't agree more with Secretary Gates about the importance of deterrence. And frankly, we are unprepared to deal with this contingency now. President Xi's told the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027. We know there's massive modernization of their military, and in addition to all of these various maneuvers around Taiwan, threatening Taiwan. But the fact is, we sort of, to continue the theme I started a little earlier, is sort of unbeknownst to us, or we really didn't focus on the fact that because we weren't going to be changing the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi, that all of the massive U.S. and other foreign investment in the United States would help them build their economy and modernize their military, and then accomplish their ideological goals in the process, threatening peace in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps more broadly. So, one of the things we've been trying to figure out is, how do we get a handle on this? And it's pretty timely. One of the things I've been working on is an outbound investment transparency provision, just so we have a better idea about what sort of investments are being made in China by American companies. We know they are relentless when it comes to stealing our technology, and they are very, very smart and very talented and very capable of developing their own technology. But it strikes me as bizarre that we have been pretty much blind to the fact that it's been our capital markets that they've been able to tap into, which have provided for investment in China, which have allowed them to not only rebuild their country, but then to threaten peace in the Indo-Pacific. So this has got a lot of different moving parts.
So, a lot of people have questioned whether or not, should China impose a blockade or invade Taiwan, would the U.S. be able to impose sanctions on China, given the size of the Chinese economy? And that, I think, raises a larger question of, we're experiencing this dramatic expansion of the use of economic warfare tools like sanctions and tariffs, both under Trump and Biden, as well as in Europe. Do you think that we are overusing these in the place of traditional diplomacy? What are the risks of using these tools? Chancellor Gates, do you want to go?
Well, I think it's important to understand the difference between the Soviet Union and China in this respect, in trying to impose sanctions on China. The Soviet Union, as former Senator John McCain once described it, essentially was a gas station with missiles. It had no economic relationships around the world. At the height of our relationship with the Soviet Union, U.S.-Soviet trade was $5 billion. At the end of 2023, U.S.-Chinese trade was right at, or maybe a little north of $700 billion. China, whereas Russia, the Soviet Union, had no economic connections other than the sale of oil and gas outside of Russia, China is the biggest trading partner of at least 120 countries around the world. There are 150 countries that are engaged in the Belt and Road Project. So the question you have to ask yourself about sanctions is, if it has been as easy as it has been for Russia to evade a lot of our sanctions and essentially rebuild their military-industrial complex with the help of China, the Central Asians, the Gulf Arabs, Turkey, and other countries, if the Russians have been able to evade so many of our sanctions in that respect, then what is the capacity of China to evade our sanctions? And so I think we have to think long and hard about how effective sanctions would be if China were to invade Taiwan. And how many countries could we get to support us in that? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. And frankly, I think we ought to, and I hope this has been happening somewhere. I suspect it hasn't, but I hope somewhere somebody is wargaming exactly this question. What kind of sanctions could effectively be imposed on China that we unilaterally could make tough enough to really hurt China? Or do we have to look for other kinds of tools in our response to a Chinese aggressive act against Taiwan? And I think we ought to be looking at other scenarios as well. What if there is a clash between the Chinese and the Philippines, with which we have a security treaty? What if there were to be some incident between China and Japan? We ought to be wargaming these things now, so that we're not all sitting around in the Situation Room after it's happened, scratching our heads trying to figure out what to do. These are things that are likely enough, or the probability is sufficient. We ought to be doing that planning right now. There clearly are economic measures we could take that could hurt China, but I'm not sure we know what they are right now and how effectively we could apply them unless other countries joined with us.
If you will permit me, I just want to, I'm sure I'll butcher this, Secretary Gates, forgive me ahead of time. I think you said at one time, of all the times we've attempted to predict where hostilities would break out around the world, we have a perfect record. We've been wrong every single time. So the complexity of trying to figure this out is really hard. And I think to Secretary Gates' point, you can't just look at what the United States' interests are, what we might do by way of sanctions, but whether or not we're going to get the cooperation of our friends and allies around the world, seeing how intertwined their economies are with China, and unlike Russia. And, just because we're friends or we're allies, I don't think we can count on that.
Okay, let's turn to the Middle East. We're now We're now 14 months since the Hamas attack, and Israel has eliminated most of the senior leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah. Biden has negotiated this tenuous ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Saudi Arabia has its own initiative, peace initiative, together with the EU and the Arab League. What do you think the prospects for peace are now? And do you think that President Biden can make any progress in the last remaining weeks of his term, or do you think it's going to be up to Trump, given his deep relationships with some of the Gulf leaders, in particular Saudi Arabia? Chancellor Gates.
Well, this is an area, first, to answer your last question first, I think there is, the chances are slim to none that Bibi Netanyahu would give Joe Biden a win before he leaves office. I think the Hezbollah ceasefire, hopefully that will hold, because I think it creates the circumstances where there might be some positive steps. But I think if Netanyahu is going to try and cement his relationship with the new president, he's going to try and figure out a way to say, we're done in Gaza, we've accomplished what we set out to do, and now let's figure out the way forward. Now, I've read that Hamas and the West Bankers have put together a group of technocrats, people who are not really either Hamas or West Bankers, just Palestinians who have respect and so on, and that might be a basis for creating some fig leaf that would give the Saudis sufficient political cover to begin to reopen the discussions with Israel about a treaty. I think President Trump will be very interested in seeing whether he can help that. I think he deserves credit for the Abraham Accords that produced the peace between Israel and the Gulf and the UAE and Bahrain. And so I'm confident he'd like to build on that. And the Saudis clearly have a more favorable view of him than they did of President Biden. And so this is one of the few areas in the world where I actually think after so much horrible humanitarian loss and so much suffering, where there may be a glimmer of a path forward that involves, well, one idea that I heard was that the Israelis might put forward was rather than having a consolidated Palestinian state, you would in effect have some number of Palestinian city-states that would somehow be networked, but it would keep them separate in a way that they couldn't be a threat to Israel again. I think that they're figuring out a way to get to that point, to some point where there is a Palestinian entity of some kind, seems to me not beyond the wit of man. And I think with Iran as weakened as it is, and basically helpless because the Israelis destroyed their air defenses, with their nuclear program set back because of the bombing of the nuclear weaponization facility that took place, and with the ceasefire with Hezbollah, you have the makings, you have all the ingredients in which you might be able to put together something that actually stops the fighting and allows the humanitarian disaster to be ended and relief provided to those in Gaza, but also those in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon as well. We'll see. And then, of course, just when you think you might have a scenario that might work, then you get a new war in Syria. So with the Iranians and the Russians backing Assad, as they have in the past, and us and Turkey and others backing another side. So, welcome to the Middle East.
Senator Cornyn?
You're saying it's complicated?
Senator Cornyn, do you think President Trump has a better chance given his, and who's going to lead that? Because Jared Kushner took the lead now, and it doesn't look like he's coming back to a second Trump term.
Yeah, I think the Abraham Accords was a major step forward in the Middle East, but I think the key actor in all of this is going to be Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. He, as you recall, he was fighting with the Houthis in Yemen, but then he sort of pulled back along with the UAE because of the humanitarian disaster that was occurring there, and also because he wanted to divert attention away from that to his Vision 2030, his attempt to transform Saudi Arabia and diversify its economy. But to me, all of this goes back to Iran, the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism, in some ways focusing on the Houthis or the Shia militias or the Hezbollah or Hamas is looking at the symptom and not the real disease. There's no simple answers, and I don't mean to suggest any of them, but I do think that at some point, it looked like there might have been an opportunity for Mohammed bin Salman to step forward, build a coalition of the Arab Gulf states to provide maybe some security guarantees in Gaza, which might perhaps form some sort of fragile beginning of security there and help stabilize the situation. But as you know, after October the 7th, the invasion by Hamas into Gaza, where so many innocent people were murdered and killed, then there's one theory that was intentional, because Israel and Saudi Arabia were coming closer and closer to some sort of normalized relationship. But now Mohammed bin Salman has pulled back and he said, no, it's contingent on a two-state solution. So we're sort of back to square one. But, you know, given what the Israelis have been able to do in terms of the air defenses in Iran must be feeling pretty vulnerable these days. Israel's demonstrated its capability of just basically doing whatever it wants in Iran, but in the meantime, they continue to enrich uranium, and we don't know for sure, certainly in a public setting. I mean, there's been a lot of different guesses as to how long, if they decided to gain a nuclear weapon, how long it would take them to do it. But if they did, it would transform the Middle East in a very negative way, because certainly Saudi Arabia would seek a nuclear weapon, and here we go down the same road we see now in North Korea, where the fact that Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons has really complicated our ability to try to resolve the potential for conflicts there. So I think there's some key actors there. We know the ultimate bad guy, in my view, is Iran. They're an existential threat to Israel, our chief ally in the Middle East. They're the state sponsor of all these terrorist organizations that continue to kill a lot of innocent people and threaten security. So it is complicated, and I guess if it were simpler, we would have figured it out before now.
I'd like to underscore a point that the senator made with respect to the Houthis. So I mentioned all of the different groups that Iran has supported that have been weakened, with the exception of the Houthis. And what's important to realize is that Houthis get their missiles from Iran. And what's worse, the Russians are providing targeting information to the Iranians to pass on to the Houthis. The Russians are giving, in essence, the Houthis the targeting information to target both U.S. warships and merchant ships that are trying to go through the Red Sea. So Iran is the only way, I think, I mean, the UAE and the Saudis fought the Yemenis and the Houthis for a long time and couldn't defeat them, including boots on the ground, a lot of boots on the ground. So I think the only solution to the Houthi problem is found in Tehran, and that is putting enough pressure on the Iranians that they stop providing the Houthis with missiles and they stop providing them with targeting information.
Let's turn to the other big problem facing us, which is Ukraine and Russia. Trump has vowed to end the war in a day, although he has not spelled out how he plans to do that. The Russian forces are on the up. They're gaining territory, and I think it's pretty clear that Putin has not given up his ultimate goal of demilitarizing Ukraine, making sure it declares its neutrality and not join NATO. Most European leaders are supporting, Ukraine continuing the fight. How do you think Trump will negotiate an end to this war, especially if Europe isn't on board? Do you want to go first, Chancellor Gates, on that one? Sorry, I'm giving you the first crack at difficult problems.
Thank you for having him go first.
I'm coming to you next with, with the first question.
So my view is that it's important. People can talk about negotiations, and various countries have offered to sponsor negotiations and so on and so forth. But one thing is clear. One person has not changed his position on what it takes to get peace in Ukraine at all, and that's Vladimir Putin. Putin has made it very clear that his terms for stopping the fighting are, first of all, he gets all 4 of the provinces in the east, in the Donbass. He only controls about 70 to 80% of those at this point. He gets those 4 plus Crimea forever. Yeah, the government in Ukraine has to be replaced by a pro-Russian government that professes to international neutrality. Ukraine has to agree never to become a member of NATO or a member of the EU, has to declare it will be neutral, and basically will have its security forces will be limited to a glorified police force so that it can never pose a threat to Russia. And by the way, the Russians get the right to protect the rights of Russians living in Ukraine. Those are his terms. He has not indicated any willingness to compromise on any of those terms. So the question then is, how do you come back at that? Well, first of all, Zelensky has been quite explicit, and really just in the last couple of weeks, that his terms, the Ukraine's terms for a ceasefire, basically require membership in NATO, and not someday, now. And no one would recognize Russian occupation of the Donbass or of Crimea. But all those other things that Putin wants would also be off the table. So Zelensky begins quite reasonably, it seems to me, with reminding people of the 1994 Budapest Agreement, in which the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia all agreed to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up 1,800 nuclear weapons. Do you think Putin would be in Ukraine today if Ukraine still had 1,800 nuclear weapons? I don't think so. So Zelensky said a piece of paper was worthless. So if I'm not a member of NATO, this isn't going to work. And he's got a case. So the question is, if NATO is not in the cards, what kind of bilateral security agreements would satisfy the Ukrainians that Putin wouldn't be back 2 years from now? And in my view, that probably involves the deployment of NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine as a tripwire. Whether that would involve American troops or not would be part of the negotiation. But there's going to have to be security guarantees for Ukraine as part of any kind of a deal. And I think that's going to be a big hurdle. That'll be a big hurdle in our Congress. It'll be a big hurdle in Europe. So that remains to be seen. So I think the president-elect genuinely wants to stop the fighting. The problem is, how do you get from here to there? And I think that's a tougher problem than it appears on the surface.
Senator Cornyn, do you think there's appetite in the Senate for continued military aid to Ukraine that would probably be necessary if such a deal were done? I mean, Ukraine's going to have to be armed to the teeth for years, and that is going to require U.S. funding. Is there appetite for that?
Well, of course, I'm really glad to hear Secretary Gates talk about the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. I think a lot of people sort of have overlooked our obligation to provide, to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine, and it may not be significant or important to a lot of people, but in terms of our credibility and encouraging countries like Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons is pretty important. But we sat there and watched what happened in Crimea and in 2014, and then of course my theory is, and it's just a theory, that when President Putin saw us pull the plug in Afghanistan and basically give the president of Afghanistan a ticket out of town, that he thought he could take Ukraine without a shot being fired because there didn't appear to be anyone willing to impose any costs. The problem with dealing with Putin, of course, is that he is okay with using his own people as cannon fodder. There can be unlimited casualties on the Russian troops, and he doesn't care because he's an ideologue, and he's going to keep coming. He wants to restore the great Russian Empire. And I'm talking to two Russia experts, so I'm an amateur in this area. But so it seems to me that, I mean, it's really hard for the United States to say to President Zelensky, you got to cut a deal when it's their backyard and it's not ours. And with the knowledge that Putin is probably, if he got a temporary cessation, let's say it's an armistice like we have in Korea, that then Putin would just reset and rebuild and keep coming at some point. And then just so it's not lost on anybody, the importance of NATO is the collective defense guarantee in Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So if any one of the NATO treaty countries is attacked, then it's a responsibility of all the other NATO countries to come to their defense. And so that would portend the potential for a larger war in Europe. And I think President Trump is, he's said a lot of different things, but one of the things that I think he's absolutely right about is Europe needs to step up and do more and not just depend on the American taxpayer to pay the price. Fortunately, we haven't had to risk any of our young men and women. We have had to make a significant investment in our treasure, but Europe needs to step up. Poland is I guess, moving to about 5% of GDP, but this is an enormously dangerous situation, and I would be ecstatic if there could be some sort of resolution, but I'm skeptical. I'd love to see what that looks like.
I'll give you two quick examples of European military unpreparedness, both from when I was secretary. When I was secretary, the German Navy had 6 submarines. Not one was operational. When we went into Libya in the spring of 2011 to take out the Libyan air defenses, France and the UK only had enough precision-guided munitions to last 2 days.
Oh my God, that's terrifying. Quickly, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, but I have to ask you, Senator Cornyn, there are obviously a lot of nominations for Trump's cabinet going before the Senate. The most controversial one of late, Pete Hegseth, as Secretary of Defense. Do you think that he has the character and experience to run the Department of Defense?
Well, we have two competing interests here. One is really the prerogative of the President of the United States, having won a national election, to have his team on board. But there's also a competing responsibility from the United States Senate to provide advice and consent. And we've seen examples already where some of the publicity associated with a nominee has resulted in them withdrawing from contention. So I don't know what may happen on the Secretary of Defense nomination or maybe some of the others along the way. But we'll start the process of having hearings once Congress is reconstituted on January the 3rd. The new Congress will be sworn in. And then I think it's going to depend a lot on what the public response is going to be. Unfortunately, the environment is just about as ugly as you can possibly imagine. Those of you who may remember Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing, what we may see might make that pale in comparison. But so I don't have any predictions for you. But
you don't think Pete Hegseth might drop out before then?
I just don't know.
Let's open it up to the audience for questions. There'll be someone with a mic going around, and I would ask that you ask questions rather than give speeches or statements. Three. I'll be taking 3 questions at a time and then put them to Chancellor Gates and Senator Cornyn. Do you want to just go to with the mic? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sure. Hello. I guess my first question would be, is the political will really there to, muster the commitment to, increase spending to all the things that I think are necessary? Is the political will really there to, seriously defend Taiwan in a war with China, to put, U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine? I would very much like to see those things. I just wonder if the political will in the country is really there.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Landon Wright. This is primarily for the senator, but back in 2018, you supported a group of GOP senators to talk to Donald Trump about possible tariffs on Mexico and sort of like a modernization of NAFTA. With President-elect Donald Trump talking more and more about possibly breaking that agreement with Canada and Mexico and imposing larger tariffs, do you see that tariffs very well could be the Republican standard to balance the budget and possibly pass his new tax cuts that he says he wishes to extend? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Adrian Ryan. I'm a sophomore. Thank you for being here today, by the way. My question was, so a lot of the issues we've been talking about this afternoon are very, serious, as you know, and I would argue that the members of a president's cabinet are among the most impactful people in the world who can help answer these issues and solve these issues. So my question is for both of you, which of President-elect Trump's appointees are you the most confident and least confident in? Thank you.
That's a good one. Who wants to take that one? Senator Cornyn, I'm going to come to you first.
Can I talk about Mexico a minute?
Sure.
So, and then we'll try to address the other things. What's been happening at the border is nothing short of a humanitarian and public safety disaster. We've seen, who knows, nobody really knows, maybe upwards of 10 million people coming across the border into my state, 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, but they haven't stopped there. And neither have the drugs that have now taken the lives of roughly 100,000 people a year, including 70,000 a year to the fentanyl, which is exponentially more potent and more dangerous and more deadly than cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and the rest. So one of the least recognized problems is that we've also had 500,000 unaccompanied children that have been placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States. The administration takes a position that it's not their responsibility to follow up on their welfare, and that it's a responsibility of the child welfare services in the individual states. Now, our relationship with Mexico has always been difficult. That maybe they still remember that what is now Texas used to be part of Mexico. Maybe and they are very protective of their sovereignty. But there are also huge swaths of Mexico that are controlled by criminal cartels. And I know there have been various ideas about what we might do. We do some intelligence sharing with Mexico, but it's very clear that they do not want any American face or other foreign countries in Mexico to try to help them to deal with these problems. But the matter is, as I told President Lopez Obrador about a year ago, I didn't know how he would react to this, but I said, Mr. President, the United States and Mexico are like an old married couple. We can't get a divorce. We have to make it work. But boy, is it hard.
Chancellor Gates, would you like to take on the last question?
I'll take on the Taiwan question. I learned as Secretary of Defense that when you come to a minefield, you don't walk in. I think, some people around the world characterize the American people as a warlike people. Actually, the opposite is true. Americans hate to go to war. And Americans, historically, have tended to be more on the isolationist front. That leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, I just want to tend to my business. And we have gone to war mainly, not always, but mainly when we've been only when we've been attacked. So World War II, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Vietnam was a presidential decision to go in, and we all know that that led to catastrophe. The decision to go into Iraq, to go into Kuwait the first time in 1991, there wasn't time for opposition to grow because the war was over in 100 hours. And so that one was quick. And then the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was clearly, became quite controversial. So I think that your question to me about is the will there, or the question to us, is the will there for the United States to defend Taiwan? And I would tell you, I think that, you know, in a very clear answer, it depends. It depends on the nature of the attack. It depends on what the Taiwanese have done to prepare and to defend themselves, whether they have conscripted their young men and women into their service in significant numbers and for more than 6 months at a time. They've just extended their conscription to a year. And it depends on the leadership of the President of the United States. The leadership that FDR showed in getting ready for World War II, but then once Pearl Harbor happened, the decisiveness that the second President Bush showed in responding to 9/11. And so it will depend also on the persuasiveness of the president, and frankly also on the reaction of the members of Congress. So, you know, I think this is one of the reasons why our policy toward Taiwan since the early 1970s has been one of strategic ambiguity. We want to leave it uncertain about what we will do, in part because I don't think any president is in a position, even though President Biden theoretically slipped a few times and said, well, we will defend Taiwan, our official strategy still is one of strategic ambiguity, and it kind of depends. But, you know, having the Chinese uncertain is not a bad thing in these circumstances.
We're running out of time, but I'm going to see if we can get 3 more quick questions, be really brief. If the mic can just find, yeah, okay, the man in the back.
Yep. Hi, so I was wondering, with the situation in Eastern Europe being so tense right now, like our relations with Russia are tense, they're trying to take over Ukraine. As that situation is so bad with Russia, do you think now is really the best time for Trump to essentially leave Western European countries in NATO to defend themselves on their own when now it's such a shaky time?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, you want me to go? All right, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'll just be real quick, about 20 seconds. All right, so we should have the whole, we are trying to negotiate settlement between Ukraine and Russia, and we claim to have moral high ground on this. You know, Ukraine is invoking this agreement. But what about Muammar Gaddafi? And wasn't there an agreement with him giving up his nukes, and then we instituted regime change into his country? Alexei Navalny, we stand with him. He was placed on solitary confinement with no visitation and tortured incarcerated in Russia. And the whole mainstream media in America was blowing their top about that, but we have hundreds of J6 defendants who were placed on solitary confinement, denied visitation, and tortured in the DC jail for many years.
What's your question?
So my question is, how can we claim the moral high ground on the world stage when we're treating people around the world and our own American citizens to the worst torture and human rights abuses that we could ever imagine? I mean, there's hundreds of Americans still in prison right now being tortured.
Okay. One more question right there. The woman right there. Right there. Right. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I thought you were. It's hard to see with the lights.
I wanted to direct the attention to Syria currently right now. The Syrian Salvation Government has started to take control of the Hama government of Syria. And I wanted to just ask a question with regards to both Senator Cornyn and Chancellor Gates. How do you consider, what dichotomy do you put Tahrir al-Sham? Do you consider them rebel groups or do you consider them terrorist groups? And additionally, should we support Bashar al-Assad against Tahrir al-Sham, or should we support Tahrir al-Sham?
Why don't we start with the last question on Syria, which is because it's so topical? Who would like to?
Well, the United States has characterized the latter group as a terrorist group, and so, you know, talking about being cautious about getting involved in situations, this is one where I think the United States can usefully stand aside. We certainly don't support Hafez al-Assad and what he has done to Syria. It's pretty tough for us also to support a designated terrorist group. So this is one where I think we take a pass and let them figure it out. You mentioned Libya. Let me just say, with respect to the actions that we took in Libya in 2011, I actually opposed that decision. And in fact, I told President Obama, you know, I'm still in the middle of, can I just finish the 2 wars I'm already in before you go looking for a third one? And what started out as a humanitarian mission to protect the people in eastern Libya and in Benghazi quickly morphed into an effort to go after command and control in Tripoli and elsewhere in Libya, which morphed into regime change. And one of the consequences of that, in my view, is the chaos that prevails in Libya today. And you're absolutely right. Gaddafi did give up his nuclear weapons in exchange for us lifting sanctions on him and so on. And frankly, the Libyans probably would have been better off had we just simply said, you can't approach Benghazi, period. But if you stay in Tripoli, we're not going to mess with you. But we didn't do it that way. It was a big mistake, and I think it led to a lot of chaos.
I always wondered what the lesson is of Ukraine and Libya when it comes to nuclear weapons. Don't you think that's one reason why Kim Jong-un has been hugging his nukes? Because they realize that's the only thing between him and regime change. And why, frankly, it's so dangerous for the supreme leader in Tehran to continue to enrich uranium and work his way at some point, if they decided to do so, to develop a nuclear weapon. And certainly they have the ballistic missiles to be able then to deliver it in the region and beyond. You know, I don't know whether an American president would have the strength of character and the will to stop Iran, but it sure would change the whole complexion of the Middle East. For my money, I'm counting on the Israelis to keep that from happening, and I wish them Godspeed.
Okay, that's been a really fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We could talk for hours, I'm sure. Thanks for the great questions, and thank you, Senator Cornyn and Chancellor Gates, for your insights today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll turn it back to, am I turning it back to the President for closing remarks, or? Okay. Thank you very much. We're done.